Eddy!
I think it's pretty obvious by now that I'm a big fan of Ed, Edd, and Eddy. In fact, it's the biggest reason I started my channel. It played such a big role in my childhood, and it helped shape my taste in animated shows. But obviously, I'm not afraid to discuss the episodes from the show I don't like. And even though I've discussed a few of them before, they were all from seasons 4 and 5, and it's safe to say there's room to grow from some of those reviews, as a few of them were my first ever reviews. And for the record, I'm implementing a rule that all seasons must have at least 5 episodes to be eligible for this list. So season 6 and its 2 episodes, I'm not including because it's not exactly much fun if there are only 2 options. So let's take a look at the low points from each season of this straight up excellent show. But before I get into that, I want to share something with you guys that I'm pretty excited about. Now, as much as I enjoy making videos on some of my favorite shows, you know they do take a little time to make, and I prefer giving you guys my full thoughts in a full-length video, and brief videos just don't feel like they belong on this channel. But luckily, I found a home for them when Amino reached out to me about partnering on their new stories feature, where you can post brief stories in a way that's still high quality and entertaining. And I'm taking advantage of that by adding a whole new line of videos that you guys can watch in the middle of my new videos being made. Like what my favorite cartoon shows or voice actors are, or what I think my best and worst videos are. So if you're interested in that, then click the link in the description or search for Amino apps to download Amino. Find my stories by searching Jem Reviews, and make sure to follow me and click the bell to know when I'm posting new videos, just like YouTube. So if you like my videos, this is a simple, free way to keep me creating. Now, let's start the video. So what's interesting about this show is that it started out incredibly strong. In fact, season 1 is as close to a flawless season as you can get in my opinion. But if I had to pick the worst episode, I'd probably go with Sir Eddy. Now this is very far from a bad episode. It has moments that are very funny, there's some insanely quotable lines, and most importantly, I fully understood what it was trying to do, and I found it entertaining. But I also think this is one of the more annoying episodes from the first season, because it's about the Eds babysitting Sarah and Jimmy. Now this could have been handled so much worse than it was, but Sarah, in particular, always feels like she sucks a little bit of the funny out of some scenes. Her constant shouting at almost every moment gets old, her bossy nature is obnoxious, and there's no charm to these characters in general. They feel like very stock kids in this season, and that stands out in a show where most of the characters seem to be unique. But honestly, that's all I have to say, because everything else about this episode is perfectly fine. Also, Eddy makes this episode because he handles everything like a champ. Every reaction he gives, every line that comes out of his mouth, it's absolutely hilarious.
Next thing you know, she's gonna want to throw a toast to my big mouth!
He saves this episode from being a mediocre one to being a genuinely decent one. It's just one of the few only decent episodes from the first season in my opinion. But it's by leaps and bounds the best episode I'm going to be talking about. Which is probably for the best because, oh boy, do these episodes get bad.
It is I, Prince Jimmy!
Season 2 was also a great season, but I think it had some episodes that were a little more, well, noticeably worse, which was bound to happen from how strong the first season was. But to this season's credit, most of its lesser episodes still aren't that bad. Ed and a Half Shell, while certainly annoying, at least wasn't unwatchable. And Key to My Ed, while pretty average, still had its memorable moments.
By multiplying the isolated bubble of carbon gas, I've invented a soda that will never lose its fizz.
Gassy.
You know what that scene is missing? This.
You stole stole fizzy lifting drinks.
But the episode I think is the worst from season 2 is actually Key to My Ed's sister episode, To Sir with Ed. This episode is about Eddy's parents going out and hiring Naz to babysit him. But Eddy doesn't realize she's babysitting him and assumes she's here to date him. Now from the get-go, this sounds promising. I could see a ton of fun, awkward moments arising from this subject. But they don't seem to take advantage of any of it. In fact, this episode feels like straight up filler. Everything in it that could have been good always feels rushed, while there seems to be more focus on useless material that could easily be cut. The dinner scene, for example, has a good setup. But while it is awkward, it's not funny awkward, because the awkwardness is so underplayed that it barely even feels like humor. And the Eds feel restricted here. Like when Naz tells Eddy to take a bath, there's a solid minute where all Eddy and Double D do is bicker at each other, and it just feels like padding.
I'll let you borrow my loofah.
You actually carry around a...
I hope you're in that tub, young man.
Nope. Excuse me, but is that a word? Eddy, don't forget the foundations of courtship. I think you need a bath. But it's your okay. At least I could get one.
That could have been cut out completely, and I feel the episode would still be the same. And there's a few moments in this episode that feel like that. Also, the ending is uncreatively set up to mess with Eddy, and it doesn't feel earned, since it's shown pretty early that Eddy is simply mistaken. But everyone just happening to appear, Naz just letting them stay, and Eddy being embarrassed at the end and punished through no fault of his own, it's such a cheap way to end the episode and so noticeably rushed, that even if this episode didn't feel like filler, it would have weakened the entire experience anyway. And it feels like this episode would have worked better if it was just the Eds and Naz. Like, you don't need these characters being thrown in. They don't even really amplify Eddy's embarrassment that much. So it feels like they could have been cut as well, and the episode would still be mostly the same. Which in turn makes the scenes that feature them just seem more pointless. But plus side, there's still some effort put into it. Like when Eddy calls Ed and Double D after finding out he's home alone, he pretends he's being attacked by a snake to get them to come over, and they show up wearing their beehive outfits from Pop Goes the Ed, with the word hive crossed out and snake written in its place. That's pretty damn subtle, and like I said, I get the attempt, but it's played so mildly here, and it's not even close to as fun as so many other episodes from this season. It does feel like they're trying to make this funny and relatable, and I appreciate that. But the episode is so jumpy, so void of focus, and has such bland humor, that I consider this among the most forgettable episodes from the whole show.
Open the door! I'm stuck!
Once again, another great season, but it's not without its black sheeps. X Marks the Ed, for example, is an episode that more fans seem to hate than enjoy, but I'm one of the fans that enjoy it. I think it's portrayed exactly how I envisioned things being when I was a teenager and started getting pimples. Other episodes like For Your Eds Only and Dimlit Ed, I think are pretty average and forgettable, and they could have been done a little bit better. But I think the absolute worst episode from this season is My Fair Ed. Aside from being just a pointless episode where nothing really funny happens, everything about it is put together so sloppy. It's about the cul-de-sac kids blaming Double D for Eddy and Ed affecting their daily lives, and demanding he change them, which Double D agrees to do, only for the two to turn into bigger pain in the necks. Even in the description, I think you can already see a problem with this episode. But this problem is made so much worse by the fact that it starts with Double D having his day ruined by them as well. And as the episode progresses, it almost acts like Double D is the one in the wrong for trying to change them in the first place.
Oh, Eddy, I'm so sorry. I've done something wrong. I should never have tried to change who you and Ed are.
Well, what choice were you given? Hell, not only is he threatened into doing this, but he even tries explaining himself to them. So I have no idea how he's the one who did anything wrong.
They won't listen to me. Don't get it, please. Wait, I should never have tried to change who you and Ed are.
I mean, you can't pick and choose like that. Either start the episode with Double D jumping to the conclusion that they need to change and making him the one in the wrong from the start, or have Double D be partially responsible for their behaviors. Like, I don't know, have him create a soda that accidentally makes them overly hyperactive and it results in all these things happening. At least make him bear some of the blame, instead of acting like he's in the wrong when the episode doesn't give him a choice. And the ending of this episode feels like a slap in the face. It basically reveals that Eddy and Ed were just being jerk-offs the whole episode. Don't get me wrong, I'm not surprised Eddy and Ed were just messing with Double D. In fact, that's exactly how I expected this episode to end. But predictability is not the problem with this episode. Hell, you can know your destination and still have fun on the way to it. But nothing about this meshes with how the episode is set up. Its end result is a lesson that you shouldn't change people. Yet, it's established 10 times over that Double D already knows this lesson. In fact, aside from Double D, everyone else is so poorly written. Not just the cul-de-sac kids, but the Eds as well. I mean, I guess Ed is still his typical moronic self, but he and Eddy feel like the same character this episode. It just stands out to me and it feels very lazy, and it makes me question what the focus was for this episode. Honestly, this episode feels like they came up with this idea a week before the episode aired. It's so rushed, there's no care and passion put into it, and it just feels like an overall episode that no one is happy with, because I can't imagine anyone who worked on this episode was giving it their all. But hey, episodes like this are gonna happen, and aside from this episode, which I wouldn't even consider worth the 11 minutes, the rest of the episodes from this season are, at best excellent, at worst, watchable.
Hey, Double D! Come here! I got something for you!
Have mercy!
Alright, Season 4. Now once again, this was a good season. But I think at this point, the bad episodes really started to stand out. Sorry Wrong Ed was pretty divisive amongst the fan base, and I would say it's pretty agreed upon that Your Ed Here is a bad episode. But for me, the worst episode is If It Smells Like an Ed. This was actually one of the first episodes I ever reviewed, and it's still one of my least favorite episodes. I think it fails as a mystery, I think it fails at being funny, I think the writing is horrible, and I think there's little entertainment to it. And I know on some sites this is classified as a Season 3 episode, but Wikipedia and IMDb both have it listed as Season 4 Episode 1, so I'm gonna go off those sites. Now I'm not gonna focus too hard on all the problems I already stated in my first review. Instead, I'm just gonna focus on some question marks I have with this episode. One of which being how good of a mystery it was trying to be. Because from the start, it's obvious who the culprit is, since there are only two real suspects. Rolf, who was given a very bland motive and implied heavily by the episode to be the culprit, so much so that he's immediately cleared, because it wouldn't even be a mystery if he did it. The other suspect is Jimmy, who was embarrassed at the beginning of the episode by Eddy, and mercilessly laughed at for a solid minute. So really, who else could it have been?
Yes! It was me! And I'd do it again!
Oh, there's a big surprise! I think I'm gonna have a heart attack and die from that surprise!
Even if you want us to believe that Jimmy would never do anything like that because he's a fluffball, we immediately know it's not the Eds, we immediately know it's not Rolf, and we have another 15 minutes to figure it out, shortly after seeing Eddy giving Jimmy an atomic wedgie, that it doesn't take long to conclude it could be Jimmy anyway. So I guess you could argue that it wasn't supposed to be a good mystery and was just supposed to be funny. And if you did find it funny, that's great. But I think the mystery aspect is focused on so much, with little actual jokes thrown in, that it really feels like they're trying to make their audience question who the culprit is. And that's just one of the many reasons fans don't like this episode. Among the piss-poor attempts at making the Ed suffering funny, despite the reasons feeling incredibly forced and poorly executed. And funny enough, I think they could have made this episode a better mystery with one small change, making Sarah the culprit. Because technically, Sarah does have a motive, but it's one the audience wouldn't really think of, because we always assume Sarah would just handle her problems with her fists. And while we are used to Eddy messing with Jimmy, The episode puts so much emphasis on Jimmy being picked on that you know it's affecting him more than his usual treatments. Also, it would totally clear up that completely stupid moment of Sarah blaming Ed for stealing her paintbrush, despite no evidence or reasoning to think that it actually would have been a pretty subtle clue despite being out in the open.
Wasn't there a paintbrush here a second ago?
Huh? I bet Ed took it!
How'd you come to that conclusion?
Well, actually, that line would have worked better if she was blaming Eddy instead of Ed. But that's one thing I talked about in my review, the other Eds being thrown in. I don't think it's executed well at all, and because of that, it's very hard for the audience to get behind their suffering. Because all other Ed, Edd, and Eddy episodes, they actually do something to warrant this. But looking back on it, them getting thrown in probably could have worked. But there was no reason for them to be thrown in immediately with Eddy. This easily could have been about Eddy getting framed and his friends just trying to help him, but they start getting framed because of that. That would at least justify throwing them in instead of pretending the excuse of they're Eddy's friends would be enough, despite them making episodes similar to this where Eddy's the only one who does wrong, and he's the only one who has to deal with it. This would also justify the ending, because even though Sarah is usually a physical person, she's still shown herself to be smart and manipulative. Hell, she was the only one who could tell the Mucky Boys were just the Eds in mud. So her doing this easily could have been excused as teaching Eddy what it's like to be mentally attacked all the time, like he does to Jimmy. I mean, I don't know if it'd be perfect, but it'd be a lot better because it wouldn't be as transparent. Most of the fans saw how forced it was, most fans didn't buy into the humor centered around the Ed suffering, and overall, this was just a horrible start to the 4th season. And if I'm being honest, I'm surprised there weren't more bad episodes from this season, because this one felt like a giant step back.
Don't mess with the best, suckers! Sarah, Howie!
Ah yes, the infamous Season 5, almost unanimously considered the worst season of the show. And I agree with that sentiment completely. Not to say that Season 5 didn't have any good episodes, it actually had a few good episodes. But honestly, while this show's season seemed to get progressively worse, this season stands out so badly. Like, the 4th season only feels a bit worse than the 3rd season, but Season 5, it feels like an Ed, Edd, and Eddy reboot. It feels much more generic, it feels like it has less focus, a lot of the episodes feel forced to work, and those same episodes are usually void of any charm or rewatchability. It just feels like a generic show in this season. But despite all of that, it's actually not too hard to find the worst episode from this season, as that episode is Smile for the Ed. And you know what? Say what you will about If It Smells Like an Ed, that episode at least feels like Ed, Edd, and Eddy. It feels like the worst episode of a good show. Smile for the Ed feels like the worst episode of a rebooted show. Hell, technically this episode was the whole reason I started doing reviews. I wasn't aware of it at the time, but still, and my feelings for it really haven't changed. It clearly doesn't know how to make Eddy suffering funny, and runs off the assumption that someone's suffering is always funny, no matter how good the content is or how much thought actually goes into the jokes. And they milk the hell out of his suffering the whole episode, even though the joke is already old by the first time they use it. And they don't really focus on anything else other than Eddy being tortured with his bad picture. And that's the single easiest way to write an episode like this. It requires little thought and it's easy to set up, not to mention it feels like this episode has absolutely no restrictions, because it also rewrites the formula for Kevin and Eddy, and it makes it more one-dimensional. While Kevin is a bully, what makes his inclusion work is he doesn't just blindly mess with them. Yeah, he calls the Eds dorks and all that, but it never goes further than that until the Eds, mostly Eddy, do something to provoke him. which makes his personality seem more likable and it's easier for the audience to get behind him. But here, he's not provoked to do anything. He does it because he wants to. And that makes this whole dynamic one-dimensional. It's the most stock way to write a bully-victim relationship. And obviously, a lot of fans saw right through it. But I'd be a little more forgiving of this if it was just a one-off thing. But this is the exact same problem Your Ed here had that turned a lot of fans off that episode. So it's something they really should have learned from at this point. Honestly, an episode like this would have worked fine if it was just Eddy constantly screwing himself over. If he took the bad picture because he spent too much time preparing that they took it before he was ready, and he just kept panicking over his bad picture and made rash judgments, all to prevent others from finding it, that would make his punishments feel a little more deserved, and they'd probably be a little more funnier. Now, they'd definitely be a lot truer to the show's usual time-tested formula, but throwing Kevin in as the one causing everything doesn't feel like it needs to be there for the episode to work. In fact, it has such little purpose to it and adds nothing of actual value. And the fact that they had to rewrite the characters and formulas just to make this episode quote-unquote work, that's the cheapest and easiest thing any writer can do. And while a lot of episodes from this season seem to be guilty of this one is by far the most obvious of it. Season 5 may be noticeably worse than the other 4, but it says something when even that isn't enough to hide an episode like this.
It's a nightmare, I tell ya!
And speaking of that, there's also someone who's a representative of the kind of people who would groan at this, the bitter singles. And that's Rolf.
Jem, this episode is what would happen if you put Sorry Wrong Ed, if it smells like an Ed, and Your Ed here, in a blender. It's that bad.